The world had shrunk to the space between one ragged breath and the next. For Hana Tanaka, Saipan in July 1944 was no longer a tropical paradise, but a canvas of hell painted in fire and ash. The air, thick with the smell of cordite and decay, vibrated with the unending percussion of American artillery. From their hidden cave on the northern cliffs, she and the other civilians listened as the voice of Imperial Japan, once a roar, became a desperate whisper. The radio broadcasts had promised that the American devils, Kichikubei, would inflict unspeakable horrors upon them if captured. They were beasts, savages who would defile their honor before ending their lives. Hana clutched the small smooth stone she had picked up from a beach that seemed a lifetime ago. She remembered the textile factory in Osaka, the hum of the looms, the simple dream of a family. Now, that life was a ghost. The final order had come down from the remaining Japanese command. It was more honorable to die for the emperor than to suffer the shame of capture. All around her, families were making the ultimate choice. Men, women, and even children were walking to the edge of the cliffs, a place the Americans would later name Banzai Cliff, and leaping into the churning sea below. The sounds were a symphony of horror, the final shouts of Tenno Heika Banzai, swallowed by the crashing waves. Hana hesitated. Her hands trembled, her spirit torn. The propaganda was afire in her mind, but a deeper, more primal instinct screamed for survival. It was then that the Americans appeared. They were not the horned demons of the radio broadcasts, but giants in dusty green uniforms, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion. One of them, a tall sergeant with tired eyes, raised his rifle, then slowly lowered it. He wasn't snarling. He was just watching her. Through a loudspeaker, a Japanese translator pleaded with them, "We will not harm you. We will give you food and water. The war is over for you." Fear warred with a sliver of desperate hope. As a U.S. Marine patrol under the command of General Holland Smith's 2nd Marine Division methodically cleared the last pockets of resistance, Hana felt a rough but not brutal hand on her arm. She squeezed her eyes shut, expecting the end. Instead, she was guided down a rocky path, her bare feet stumbling over the volcanic rock. She was now a prisoner of war, a status she had been taught was worse than death. As she was led away, all she could think of were the stories, the warnings of the monsters she was now in the hands of. The reality of her fate, she was certain, would be far worse than anything she could imagine. The days that followed bled into a haze of heat, dust, and confusion. Hana and the other survivors were moved to Camp Susupe, a sprawling, hastily constructed internment camp fenced with barbed wire. It was a cage of ghosts. The living were haunted by the dead they had left behind on the cliffs and in the caves. The women whispered among themselves, their voices brittle with fear. The expected brutality never came. Instead, there was a monotonous routine. Morning roll call, meager but consistent meals of rice and canned fish, and the endless, watchful eyes of the American guards. This quiet, orderly existence was more unsettling than violence. It didn't align with the propaganda that had been seared into their minds. The American soldiers were not the slobbering monsters they had been promised. They were boys, mostly, with faces that were too young for the hardness in their eyes. They performed their duties with a detached professionalism that was utterly bewildering. They handed out chocolate bars to the children who, too young to understand the doctrine of hate, accepted them with wide-eyed wonder. From his guard tower, Sergeant Frank Miller watched the compound. An Ohio farm boy who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, the savagery of the island fighting had almost broken him. Guarding the prisoners was a strange purgatory. He wrote home in a letter he wasn't sure would ever arrive. October 5th, 1944. Dear Ma, The fighting is over here, but the island doesn't feel peaceful. We're guarding the civilians now. Thousands of them. It's not what I expected. They were told we'd hurt them, and they look at us like we're something out of a nightmare. There's one young woman. She can't be much older than Cousin Sarah. She just sits and stares, clutching a little rock. She doesn't cry or scream. She's just gone. It's a look I've seen too many times. Sometimes I look at them and I don't see the enemy. I just see people. It makes you wonder. I hope the harvest was good this year. I miss the smell of turned earth. One morning, the routine was broken. A group of American officers arrived with translators. A new order had come, a directive influenced by Washington's need to understand the psychology of an enemy that would rather commit mass suicide than surrender. Select groups of prisoners, including many of the women who had worked in military support roles, were to be transported. Not to another island, not to Guam or Hawaii. They were being taken to the United States. A wave of collective shock and terror rippled through the women. America, the heart of the beast, the devil's lair, Oni no Sumika. The rumors flew instantly. They were being taken there to be put on display, to be experimented on, to suffer a fate worse than anything they could have endured on Saipan. As Hana was herded with a group of other women toward the docks, the fear she felt on the cliffs returned with a vengeance. She was being led into the mouth of the monster, and this time there was no escape. The vast gray hull of an American transport ship loomed over them, a floating steel coffin ready to carry them into the abyss. The transport ship was a world of groaning steel and the perpetual, rhythmic sigh of the ocean. For 3 weeks, this gray purgatory was Hana's universe. The women were kept in a large, clean, but crowded hold. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and antiseptic. They were fed 3 times a day, given medical checkups, and left mostly to themselves. This enforced idleness was a new kind of torment. With no work to distract them, their minds replayed the horrors of Saipan, the faces of loved ones lost, the terrifying uncertainty of their future. A few days into the voyage, they were addressed by a woman in an American Army uniform. But her face was Japanese. She was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American, working as a translator for the U.S. military. Her name was Mary Sato. She spoke perfect, formal Japanese, but her crisp uniform and confident posture made her an alien figure. "You are being taken to a relocation center in the continental United States," Mary explained, her voice steady but devoid of warmth. "You will be treated in accordance with international law. You must follow all instructions for your own safety." The women stared back, a wall of silent hostility. In hushed whispers they called her Inu, dog, a traitor to her blood. Hana watched her, confused. She saw the other women's contempt, but in the translator's eyes she also saw a deep, weary sadness. This woman was caught between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. For the first time, Hana saw a crack in the monolithic image of the enemy. The devil, it seemed, could have a human face, and one that looked like her own. One morning, a new vibration ran through the ship's deck. A fog, thick as cotton, enveloped them. Then, as the sun burned it away, a gasp went through the hold. It was land, but it was unlike any land they had ever seen. 2 colossal red towers rose from the water, supporting a bridge of impossible size, painted the color of blood against the morning sky. San Francisco. The scale of it was staggering, inhuman. It was not the creation of men, but of giants. This single structure spoke more of American power than all the bombs and warships they had witnessed. As they were herded off the ship and onto a guarded train, the sensory assault was overwhelming. The air smelled different. The light looked different. The people were a chaotic mix of faces, their language a meaningless torrent of sound. The train began to move, pulling them away from the coast and into the vast, unknown heart of the nation they had been taught to hate and fear. The ocean was behind them, but Hannah felt she was drowning all the same. The train journey was a descent into an incomprehensible new reality. For days, they traveled east. The America that Hannah saw from the grimy window was not a country of sprawling cities, but one of terrifying, unending emptiness. The sky was an immense, pale blue bowl that dwarfed the land. They passed through mountains of red rock and deserts that seemed to stretch into eternity. This vastness was a form of power in itself, a silent testament to a nation so large it could swallow Japan whole. The women spoke less and less. The certainty of their hatred was being eroded by the sheer scale of the landscape. Their propaganda had spoken of an America strained to its limits, its resources depleted, its people starving. But outside their window, there was no sign of weakness. There was only space, power, and an unnerving, profound peace. The train finally slowed as it crossed the flat, gridded plains of Nebraska. It was late afternoon, and the low sun cast long shadows across the fields. The train came to a temporary halt near a crossing, waiting for a signal. It was here that the moment came. Through the window, Hannah saw a field. It was an enormous rectangle of rich, black earth, stretching further than any rice paddy she had ever seen. On it, a single man was working. He was old, his back stooped, his face weathered not by war but by sun and wind. He sat atop a green and yellow machine, a tractor, that chugged along with a steady, powerful rhythm, pulling a plow that turned the dark soil in perfect, glistening furrows. The man, John Abernathy, looked up at the setting sun, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and continued his work, completely oblivious to the train full of Japanese prisoners watching him. A hush fell over the train car. The whispers stopped. The nervous fidgeting ceased. Every woman stared out the window at the same scene. This was not a soldier. He was not young and conscripted. He was an old man, well-fed and robust, calmly plowing a field larger than their villages back home. He was using a machine of immense power for a simple, peaceful task. The propaganda, the frantic radio broadcasts, the posters of skeletal American soldiers, the promises of a decadent nation on the verge of collapse, it all shattered in an instant. It was a lie. It had all been a lie. They had been told America was throwing its last boys into the meat grinder. But here, an old man worked the land, untouched. They had been told the enemy was starving. But this land was a picture of boundless abundance. In that moment, the women understood a truth more devastating than any bomb. The war was not just lost, it was unwinnable from the very start. They had been sacrificing themselves, watching their families leap from cliffs for a fantasy. They had thrown their lives against a force they could not even comprehend. No one spoke. No one cried. They were simply speechless, their faces pressed against the glass, watching a single American farmer reveal the futility of their entire world. Hannah looked at her own reflection in the window, a pale, ghostly face superimposed over the vast, indifferent field. The stone in her hand suddenly felt very heavy, a relic from a life that no longer existed. The rest of the train journey unfolded in that same profound silence. The image of the old farmer, a solitary figure of immense, unknowable strength, had burned itself into the collective consciousness of the women. He was not a warrior. He was a creator, a tender of the earth. In his quiet diligence, they had witnessed a truth more powerful and crushing than any naval bombardment. Their war, their sacrifice, their emperor worship, it all seemed like a child's tantrum in the face of this quiet, immeasurable power. They arrived at a camp near Kearney, Nebraska. It was not the place of torture they had been promised, but a series of simple wooden barracks surrounded by fences set under the colossal, indifferent sky. The routine was Spartan but humane. They were given tasks: laundry, cooking, tending small vegetable gardens. For Hannah, working the soil was a strange echo of the scene from the train window. The dark, rich earth felt alien in her hands, different from the volcanic soil of Japan. Each time she pulled a weed or watered a seedling, the image of the tractor returned to her. Months passed. The seasons began to turn. The brutal heat of the plain summer gave way to a crisp autumn. In August of 1945, the camp commandant, accompanied by the Nisei translator Mary Sato, assembled all the prisoners in the main square. His face was grave. Mary's voice, when she translated, was flat, stripped of all emotion. 2 weeks ago, a new and powerful bomb was used against the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, another was used against Nagasaki. On August 15th, His Majesty the Emperor announced the unconditional surrender of Japan. The war is over. There was no wailing, no screams of banzai, no defiant cries. The sound that followed the announcement was the sound of a slow, collective exhalation, as if a breath held since Saipan was finally released. A few women sank to their knees, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But mostly, there was just stillness. The news was not a shock. It was merely the formal punctuation at the end of a sentence they had learned to read on a Nebraska field months earlier. It was the confirmation of a defeat they had already processed in their hearts. In the spring of 1946, as they awaited repatriation to a country they no longer recognized, Hannah stood by the fence, looking out at the vast, greening plains. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, smooth stone she had carried from the shores of Saipan. It had been her last link to a world of honor, duty, and divine purpose. She had clutched it on the cliffs, on the ship, on the train. She looked at the stone, then back at the endless fields. The America she had discovered was not a nation of devils, but one of silent, terrible power. A power not of malice, but of simple, overwhelming existence. She opened her hand. The stone, a tiny piece of a shattered world, dropped from her palm and disappeared into the Nebraskan soil. She felt no sense of loss. There was only a great, aching emptiness, and the profound, echoing silence of the truth.